Turn off the light. Let your room slowly sink into darkness. The sound of the fan, the wind, or the distant footsteps on the street begins to fade. You can pull the covers up a little higher, find the most comfortable position for yourself, and allow your eyes to gently close with the rhythm of your breath. Tonight, we will leave the present, leave behind our daily worries, to return to a world far away. A place where people lived amidst wooden walls, thatched roofs, the smell of kitchen smoke, and the sound of church bells echoing through the fog. In that world, there were ordinary mothers, yet their lives were filled with extraordinary challenges. They had no doctors to diagnose, no hospitals to rely on, and no books for detailed guidance. Instead, their journey of motherhood was woven from whispered prayers, from charms hung over the bed, from herbs hanging from the rafters, and from the experiences passed down through generations of women. In a small room where the candlelight trembled and cast shadows, the future of an unborn child was already a source of worry, hope, and the miracle the entire family gambled on. Imagine a clay house with a straw roof. The winter wind seeps through the cracks in the door. Inside, a crackling fire radiates warmth. On the wall hang small linen pouches, hastily sewn, which might contain grains, a piece of wood, or even a dried toad believed to protect the mother. No one was certain what worked, but in a world full of uncertainty, faith was the only medicine they had. You can hear the whispers of women gathered around the expectant mother. Prayers sent to the saints, advice to avoid this food or to not step over that animal. These customs were both rustic and mystical, like a thin veil draped over daily life. And in the dim light, the mother sat, her hand on her belly, listening to every faint movement within, filled with both anxiety and hope. Tonight, we will walk with them, these medieval mothers, through every stage, from a pregnancy filled with strange rituals, to labor in a dark room with a special wooden chair, and finally to the moment a new soul cries out its first welcome to the world. You will hear about the role of the midwife, the goddess of chaos, who stood on the border between life and death. You will see simple, sometimes peculiar beliefs that concealed very human fears and desires. And you will understand why, amidst the darkness and uncertainty, every child's birth was considered a miracle. So let your mind drift slowly with the story. Relax your shoulders. Let go of your burdens. Picture the golden firelight flickering on the thatched roof, the faint scent of herbs in the air, and the heartbeat of an expectant mother. When the wind outside the porch gently shifts, it is time for us to open the first chapter, beginning with the first trimester and its ancient customs. Congratulations! At least, that is what people of the past might have said upon realizing you were pregnant. There were no test kits, no doctors, and certainly no cycle tracking calendars. All signs came from the body, from feelings, and from the scrutinizing eyes of the village. It was believed that when you suddenly felt tired, nauseous in the morning, or simply liked to doze off by the hearth, your womb was nurturing a new life. But don't expect to keep it a secret. The news spread faster than the wind through the thatched roofs, and within a few days, the whole village was whispering. In the gray, mud-walled houses, they had their own ways of testing for pregnancy. Urine was collected in a ceramic pot and left overnight under the eaves. The next morning, the midwife or an herbalist would tilt the pot under candlelight. observing its color, smell, or even dropping a small iron needle into it. If the needle tarnished, they would nod sagely. Yes, a new life is growing. Oh, honey, some could conclude it just by watching your slow gait. Everything was based on experience, word of mouth, and belief rather than certainty, and with the good news came a long list of prohibitions. You were not to eat eel, as it was said the child would be slippery and hard to hold. You avoided cabbage, for it was believed to cause bad breath and a stubborn temperament. And rabbit meat was absolutely forbidden, lest the child's eyes become wild like a forest creature's. Instead, you were advised to eat white bread, a few apples, or whatever the neighbor's goat didn't finish. There was always more advice than food on the table. Family and neighbors would compete to give you protective charms. A lead amulet inscribed with a short prayer. A tuft of wolf fur hung at the head of your bed. A walnut carved with a saint's name, passed down from your mother-in-law, accompanied by the story that it had protected her through 9 births, 6 of which were successful, and that was enough to boast about. In the eyes of medieval people, these small objects were not just decorations, but shields against the invisible forces lurking in the night. Along with charms came countless rules. Do not look directly at the moon, or the child will be born with defects. Do not step over a dog, for the fragile soul could easily be possessed. And most importantly, do not laugh during a storm, because the thunder would leave its mark on the child. Every action, no matter how small, could imprint upon its destiny. In the village, this advice was repeated over and over, and the mother could only nod, taking it to heart, feeling both bewildered and desperate for protection. Sometimes the priest would enter the story. He would advise you to go to confession, to purify your soul in order to prevent risks to the fetus, and you, clutching a cloth pouch containing a dried toad, a strange charm given by the healer, would kneel silently, listening to the sermon about Eve and her sin. No one was sure why a toad was connected to the womb, but many women wore it at their side as a mystical balance, and so did you. Meanwhile, your husband, let's call him Wulfric, chose a different way to express his joy. He would drink a few extra mugs of strong ale, boasting to his friends that his seed had taken root. But he would not be by your side when you gave birth. According to custom, that was women's work. All that was left for you was the waiting, with a body changing day by day, surrounded by charms, strange advice, and the watchful eyes of the entire community. And so the first trimester passed, like a series of trials, heavy with faith, yet soaked in anxiety. You lived amidst the smoke of firewood, the scent of herbs, the sound of church bells, and the whispers of neighbors. And when night fell, you lay listening to the wind through the thatched roof, clutching your small charm bag, silently hoping that God would have mercy, and that the child in your womb would grow in peace. In that medieval world, science did not yet exist, and medicine had not yet taken shape. The only thing you had was faith. And faith in those first months of pregnancy was the gentle breath that helped you take each day, one step at a time. As time went on, your belly grew, your steps became heavier, and the once loose linen dress now swelled like a small sail. But unlike today, where there are prenatal classes, consulting nurses, and monitoring doctors, in the medieval world, all your prenatal care was contained in a handful of dried herbs, a few red ribbons, and advice that was a mix of superstition and generational wisdom. First, you were told to stay warm, but not too warm, to be active, but not to exert yourself, to laugh just enough, but to avoid sinful thoughts. This was all meant to keep the humors in your body, what the ancients believed were the four fluids that determined health and personality, from being disturbed. It was said that during pregnancy, you became phlegmatic, and therefore needed quiet and gentleness to balance your humors. It sounded vague, but everyone believed in it absolutely. Instead of vitamins, you received a bundle of herbs from the midwife or the village healer. It might be mugwort, fennel, or a handful of rue. They were brewed into a tea, its bitter taste spreading across your tongue, leaving a simmering heat in your stomach. Some said it helped the fetus grow strong. Others whispered that after drinking it, you would easily dream of saints, a sign of good fortune. And if you happened to faint or tremble after drinking it, that was just the price to be paid. As your belly became more pronounced, the midwife visited more often. She not only observed your walk and listened to your breathing, but also inspected your room. On the bedpost, she would tie more red ribbons, the color of life, of blood, of blessings. From the rafters, she hung garlic, believed to ward off evil spirits. If a storm was approaching, she advised you to lie still, close your eyes, so your soul would not be startled by the thunder. And you were absolutely forbidden from witnessing an execution in the town square, for it was believed that the image of blood and the sound of screams could leave a mark on the unborn child. In those days, your emotions also became a serious matter. It was believed that a sorrowful mother would give birth to a weak child. But how could one be happy when the world around you was so harsh? For this reason, women in the village often gathered around the expectant mother, singing hymns, telling old stories, or simply gossiping by the fire. They came not just to talk, but to keep the atmosphere light, to prevent dark thoughts from clinging to the mother. In the small room, giggles mingled with prayers, creating a soft rhythm for each passing day. And then came a special moment. The first time you felt the quickening, a gentle kick, like the flutter of a butterfly in your belly. For medieval women, this was an event as momentous as a festival. Neighbors came to congratulate you, relatives kissed your cheeks, and the midwife nodded with a smile, whispering that the child was surely healthy and had likely been marked by the hand of God. Sometimes, just to be sure, someone might sprinkle holy water on your belly, as if to bless the new life directly. You walked more slowly, avoided climbing stairs, and had to be careful even when sneezing, as it was believed that a sneeze that was too forceful could trigger labor. Bathing was almost forbidden. Water, according to belief, could loosen the life within, causing the womb to lose its grip, so you only washed sparingly, surrendering to the smells of kitchen smoke and herbs that masked your changing body. Throughout all those months, you lived within a circle of taboos, rumors, and the strangely tender care of your community. Every tied herb, every prayer, every red ribbon on the bedpost was a way for the village to face the fragility of life with you. And in the simple clay room, you lay listening to the wind whistling through the thatch, telling yourself, if I observe enough restrictions, if I tie enough charms, then maybe this time everything will be all right. But no matter how careful you were, the day that everyone in the village had been anxiously awaiting finally arrived. There was no concept of a due date as we know it today. No one marked it on paper. No calendar had a square circled in red. All the mother felt were strange pains, gentle contractions, and the intuition that the moment had come. It was believed that if an expectant mother dropped a turnip, the baby might just slip out with it. So when her belly began to cramp, no one was surprised. They simply whispered, "The time has come." The birthing room was not a special chamber in a church, and certainly not a hospital. It was just the familiar bedroom, but now it was completely transformed. The windows were covered with linen cloth to block out the outside light. It was believed that bright light would confuse the baby or make it easier for evil spirits to find their way in. The atmosphere thus became dim, lit only by small, flickering candles that created a dance of shadows on the earthen walls. From the rafters hung bunches of dried herbs, mugwort, lavender, nettle, and even rosemary. They both emitted a pungent smell and served as protective charms against evil spirits. Beside the hearth, a pot of water was boiling, sending up clouds of steam that carried the scent of fresh firewood. The thin vapors mingled with the smell of beeswax from the candles, enveloping the room in a hazy veil. The midwife entered, her figure sturdy, wearing an old apron stained by time. In her hands were her familiar tools, a wooden birthing chair passed down from one generation into the next, a few clean linen cloths, a bucket of hot water, and a small wooden crucifix. No one knew exactly when, but that birthing chair had become the center of every birth in the village. A chair with a low back and a hollowed-out seat, designed to make gravity an assistant. The mother was helped to sit down, her breath coming in short gasps, yet she tried to remain calm. Other women, sisters, neighbors, friends gathered around, praying, rubbing her back, and whispering words of encouragement. Some held charms in their hands, while others lightly sprinkled holy water around the room. It all merged into a ritual that was both chaotic and solemn, where fear and hope intertwined. The midwife's voice was deep and steady. "Breathe, slowly, no need to rush." The air grew thick. The mother tried to keep a steady rhythm, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, her eyes half closed, as if to focus all her strength on letting her body do the rest. Outside the door, her husband paced back and forth, forbidden to enter. The men stood together, arms crossed, nodding, but their eyes were filled with worry. Inside, the prayers rose steadily. "Saint Margaret, please protect us. Saint Anne, please shelter us." Some mumbled prayers from a book, while others whispered stories of previous births, as if to offer reassurance. An elderly woman even sat knitting in the room, as it was believed the up and down motion of the needles would create a rhythm to help the birth proceed smoothly. All of these things, however strange they sound, stemmed from a single desire: to keep both mother and child safe. The wooden chair, the candlelight, the herbal smoke, the tightly clasped hands, all came together to create a space that was both suffocating and sacred. The outside world seemed to melt away. There was only this room, this breath, and this small prayer echoing upwards, hoping that tonight a new cry would break the fragile silence. In this room, amidst the breaths and the small prayers, hoping for a new cry to be heard, all eyes turned to the one person who could make that hope a reality, the midwife. She was not just a witness, she was the soul of the birth. If the mother was the protagonist in a silent battle, the midwife was the commanding general, guiding, reassuring, and defending against the chaos of the womb and fate. They called her by name, perhaps Agnes, perhaps Matilda, but whatever her name, it was associated with strength and experience. She entered the room without fanfare, but the atmosphere changed instantly. She was short and stout, with calloused hands and eyes that were both sharp and calm. Around her neck, she wore a dark wooden crucifix, and her apron was stained with the marks of many years of assisting births. Those old stains, rather than causing alarm, inspired trust. She had been through it all, and she was still standing. The midwife's toolkit was simple, but in the eyes of the people of that time, it was almost divine. An old birthing chair, a sharpened knife, both for cutting and, if necessary, for warding off evil, a bundle of herbs tied tightly with linen cord, a few clean cloths, and a small, well-worn prayer book. Everything was neatly arranged in a woven basket, as if she carried medicine, religion, and magic, all with her to the mother's bedside. Her role was not limited to medicine. The midwife was also the one who set the rhythm for the entire room. If she was calm, everyone else was calm. If her voice suddenly sharpened, it was a sure sign that something was wrong. She knew when to place a hand on the mother's shoulder, when to tell everyone to be quiet, and when to read a prayer aloud to drown out the cries. Some of her words sounded like scolding, but in that moment, it was her directness that helped the mother regain her strength. In the community, the midwife status was always both high and low. She was respected because she was the only bridge for life to continue. But she was also scrutinized, as any mishap could turn into an accusation of witchcraft, of being a bad omen, of bringing abnormality. If she was too successful, people suspected she used dark arts. If she had too many failures, they whispered that she brought bad luck. Yet despite the suspicious glances, she always showed up, in winter and in summer, in times of village joy, and during outbreaks of disease. There were times she had to manage a breech birth when the baby hesitated to find the right way out. Sometimes she delivered a baby while snow fell heavily outside the window, and by the fire, a curious goat poked its head in. There were even times when, amidst the chaos, she had to shoo away overly talkative relatives to maintain the necessary quiet. She never gave up, because she knew well the lives of two people, mother and child, rested in her hands and her vigilant eyes. And when the baby finally let out its first cry, she did not clap or cheer like the others. She simply nodded, wrapped the infant tightly, handed it to the mother, and then continued to clean up, as if it were just another day at work. But for everyone in the room, that moment was a miracle, and the midwife, in her extraordinary calmness, was the goddess of chaos of the medieval world, the one who single-handedly kept the entire village from fading away in silence. She was the one who single-handedly kept the entire village from fading away in silence, but even she could not banish the pains that crashed like waves against a shore in the room thick with the scent of herbs. Today, we have medicine, injections, and anesthesia, but in the medieval world, pain relief was a fragile concept, woven from hope, prayer, and, at times, a few sharp words from the midwife. It was believed that pain was ordained by God. If childbirth were painless, humanity would surely have been created differently. Therefore, enduring the pain was seen as an essential part of a mother's duty. Women screamed, but they were not allowed to show weakness. Their cries had to sound like pleas, not complaints. Cries that were too loud could, according to folk belief, attract the attention of evil spirits lurking outside the door. Still, there were small ways to find solace. In the mother's hand might be a holy relic, a small piece of bone said to belong to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Whether it was real or not, no one could be sure. But clutching that object, the expectant mother could find a measure of peace, as if the pain was being shared with an invisible hand. In the corner of the room, a pot of herbal water was set to boil, its fragrant steam filling the air. The midwife would give the mother a small cup of the dark brown liquid, made from mugwort, rue, and a few other strange leaves. The bitter taste spread, both acrid and strong, leaving a hazy feeling between drunkenness and sobriety. No one knew if it actually helped, or if it just made the mind temporarily forget a portion of the pain. But for a moment, with the taste of herbs still on her lips, the mother could breathe a little more evenly. Sometimes she was advised to bite down on a piece of linen cloth or a small wooden stick, not to protect her teeth, but to stifle her screams, so that the other women in the village would not be frightened when they heard them. The cloth would become soaked with sweat and tears, but at least it served as an anchor in the dizzying pain. And above all, there was the midwife's voice. She might whisper, she might scold, but it always rang out with certainty. Breathe deep, slow down, don't give up, just one more push. In the chaos, that voice was like an anchor line, keeping the mother tethered to reality. Sometimes she would even add a half-joking reprimand. Your mother bore 12, and this is only your first. Strangely, that scolding often made mothers laugh through their tears, giving them the strength to fight on. All of these methods, the holy relic, the cup of herbal water, the tightly bitten cloth, and the midwife's steady hand, combined to form a strange lullaby. It did not soothe the child, but the mother, letting her know that she was not alone. The pain, though it never disappeared, was supported by faith, by community, and by the resilience that had become second nature to the women here. When the pain subsided for a moment, the room would sink back into quiet prayers and the crackling of the wood fire. No one knew how intense the next wave would be, but in that brief calm, everyone closed their eyes, whispering a prayer. Please let both mother and child make it through the night. The prayer, please let both mother and child make it through the night, echoed in the brief moments of calm, before the pain returned with the familiar, relentless beat of a drum, a rhythm that could not be measured. You ask in exhaustion, how much longer? The midwife just shakes her head, murmurs a prayer, and no one can answer. Because in the medieval world, labor had no timetable. It could be 2 hours or it could be 2 days. Time in this room, filled with herbal smoke, had abandoned numbers. It was now only the waning candlelight and the ragged breaths. The mother would sometimes sit on the wooden chair, sometimes kneel on a straw mat, then shift to a squatting position, as if her body were searching for an escape route for a new soul. With each change, the midwife would nod, believing the baby would find its way out more easily. But for the mother, Every movement felt like entering a labyrinth, where her knees trembled and her back ached. The entire room was submerged in a repetitive cycle, moaning, praying, gasping for air, and then silence again. The half-burnt candle dripped wax in winding streams. The mother stared at it, trying to count each drop, but she could no longer distinguish between day and night. Outside, the crowing of the rooster or the howling of a dog sounded distant and strange, offering no clue as to the time. There were only the sudden contractions, arriving like drunken horsemen, knocking at the door, loud and then gone without warning. You try to count them, then lose track, then give up, left with nothing but tired eyes staring up at the thatched roof. The women around also tried to keep spirits up. One would tell a story of how she gave birth during a thunderstorm, and now her son has ears that can hear lightning. Another believed that rubbing some lard on the lower back and reciting a hymn backward would make the baby come faster. No one dared to try it, but the story lessened the tension, and a faint laugh would ripple through the heavy air. In the silence, you could hear the bubbling of the water pot, the crackling of the firewood, and the midwife occasionally whispering, "Be calm, it will pass." The world shrank to those sounds, to the smell of burning dried herbs, to the sweat rolling down your temples. You start naming the cobwebs in the corner of the room, as if to hold on to a sliver of sanity. A large web, a small one, their threads trembling in the candlelight. They were as patient as you, waiting for what was to come. Then, suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The pain became fierce, with no respite. The midwife leaned in, her eyes focused, her strong hands on your shoulders. The prayers grew louder, and the women around you clasped each other's hands tightly. No one said it, but everyone understood. The moment was near. Time, which had long since disappeared, now melted away completely. There was only one reality left. Your body was opening to bring a new life into the world, as the mother's body was opening to bring a new life into the world. Just outside the tightly shut wooden door, a man was also enduring his own battle. It was the husband, the one who had sown the seed of life, yet was kept outside, an unwilling spectator to the most important stage of his own life. He paced back and forth in the yard, his cloth shoes damp with dew, his feet treading on the straw-littered ground. In his hand, a worn rosary was being worked through, bead by bead, as if he were trying to count his own heartbeats. The same prayer was repeated over and over, mingling with the distant howl of a dog and the sound of the wind whistling through the thatched roof. The man bowed his head, whispering pleas to the saints and to God himself for his wife to pull through. Other men from the village were also present, standing in small groups in the yard. They could do little more than nod and offer comments like, "This is in God's hands," or "My first wife was in pain for 2 days straight." The words were of no help, but at least they made the atmosphere outside the door a little less heavy. The husband, no matter how worried, was not allowed inside. The birthing room was a woman's world, a place where they held hands, shared experiences, and faced a chaos that men were considered too weak to bear. If a husband dared to burst in, the midwife would shoo him out immediately, perhaps even scolding him mercilessly. They believed a man's presence would bring disorder, interrupt the rhythm of the prayers, and possibly attract the attention of evil spirits. so all he was left with was his endless pacing. Occasionally, he would look up, waiting for a cry to erupt from within. But there was only the wind. Every prolonged moment of silence made his heart grow heavier. Sometimes he thought he heard a scream, and his trembling hand would grip the rosary tighter, his lips murmuring the prayers faster. The husband was an outsider, but he also carried a share of the burden. He knew that if the worst happened, he might have to enter to hear a final confession, or to hold a child that was no longer breathing. But he also knew that if something wonderful happened, someone would open the door, smile, and announce the news, and his life would be different from that moment on. In that long night, his role was utterly simple: to pace, to pray, and to wait. That was all, but for a medieval man, it was all the strength he could offer his wife, the strength of faith. The strength of faith was all he could offer his wife, while inside, time had melted away. There was no longer any distinction between night and day, only relentless contractions, heavy breathing, and prayers that sounded like a distant, rhythmic drum. Then, amidst the chaos, the final moment arrived, the moment everyone in the room had been waiting for, and the one that every soul both feared and hoped for. The mother was helped onto the birthing chair. Her hands gripped the wooden edge, worn smooth by generations before her. Her face was pale in the candle light, sweat soaking her hair. Around her, the women whispered pleas. "Saint Margaret, please be here." The midwife sat low, her aged eyes still bright, like a lamp in the night. Her voice rang out, concise. "It is time, push." The pain hit with ferocious intensity, shattering the silence. The mother screamed, not a cry of complaint, but a call for a new soul to enter the world. With every ragged breath, every forceful push, the entire room seemed to tremble. Childbirth is often compared to a battle, but here it was more like a sacrifice, where the body becomes a path, and new life is forced to emerge. And then, a sudden release, a sharp, reedy cry, pierced the air. It was faint but clear enough to make everyone let out a sigh of relief. The baby was born, red, tiny, and slick, like a cannonball just fired from nature's machine, wrapped in the wet membrane of the world within. The midwife caught it with her calloused hands, her movements decisive and steady. A gentle pat, a quick breath, and the baby cried out louder. The women surrounding them burst into tears. Some clasped their hands in prayer, others laughed through their tears. The prayers turned into thanks. The tense atmosphere vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief, as if the whole room had been thrown open to a fresh breeze. The mother collapsed back against the chair, her eyes closed, exhausted but relieved. A trembling hand reached out, lightly touching the tiny creature, as if she couldn't believe it was really here. The midwife, with her customary calm, wrapped the baby in a linen cloth. She gave it a quick look, all hands, all feet, breathing steadily. Then she placed it in the mother's arms. There were no flowery words, no songs, just a slight nod. But that nod was the confirmation. Mother and child were both alive. Outside, the husband heard the first cry. His feet froze in the middle of the dewy yard. The rosary fell to the ground, his trembling hand grabbing onto a wooden post. He looked up at the thatched roof, where the candle inside still flickered, and in the rough eyes of a medieval man, tears he couldn't hold back began to well. That moment of birth, with all its hardship, sweat, prayers, and the shattering cry, became an indelible mark. A new soul had entered the world, a world full of mud, disease, and uncertainty, but its cry still rang out strong, as if to declare, "I am here." That cry rang out strong, a declaration of "I am here," a welcome to this uncertain world. But not every birth was greeted with that sound. Some nights the room filled with smoke and herbs would fall into a heavy silence, colder than the wind on the open moors. When the baby was born, with its lips sealed, its chest still, the entire room would freeze. The mother would lean back, her eyes wide, her heart twisting in anticipation of a sound that would never come. In that moment, every face would change. The midwife did not cry or lament. Her calloused hands moved with the quick reflex of someone who had witnessed this too many times. She would reach for the bowl of holy water placed on the table, or if there was none, any water would be used. Well water, stream water, even diluted wine. In the medieval mind, nothing was more terrifying than a small soul departing without being baptized. They needed just one sign, however small, a gasped breath, a trembling movement, a fleeting shudder. If there was one, the midwife would immediately sprinkle a few drops of water on the forehead, murmuring, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." The words were rushed, like a thin thread, connecting the tiny being to heaven. In those seconds, anyone could perform the baptism. The midwife, a neighbor, even a cousin, standing trembling in the corner. Salvation did not wait for credentials or a full ceremony. But when the child remained still, when its skin had turned pale with no sign of life, the room fell into a hazy realm of theology and despair. The mother would sob, but she was often not allowed to cry loudly. The other women would place their hands on her shoulder, comforting her while trying to keep their own cries from drowning out the prayers. In many communities, they would perform what was called a baptism of desire, simply stating, "We intended to baptize him," and entrusting the soul to God. In some places, there were whispers of baptism of longing or conditional baptism, desperate attempts to open a small path for the infant soul to pass through the gates of heaven. Even so, no one truly knew the answer. The church debated, but in the small earthen room, there was only a mother, holding a still bundle, whispering a name that was meant to be used when the baby first cried. The midwife, her face somber, would wrap the child in a clean linen cloth and set it aside. If it had been baptized in time, the baby was considered a little angel, buried near holy ground, sometimes under the shade of an apple or oak tree, as if to give the young soul a place to rest. If not, they were forced to commend it to God in silence, believing that a merciful Lord would understand their pain. Outside, the wind still blew, and the church bells might ring from afar, a reminder that life does not stop. But in that room, a mother's heart had just broken. That silence, the silence of a stillbirth, was heavier than any cry. And then, like so many generations before her, the woman would have to force herself up, wipe her tears, because life did not allow her to pause for long. In the medieval world, life was as fragile as a flickering candle. When silence replaced a cry, the whole village would bow its head, and there was only the faint hope that somewhere far beyond the starry sky, the tender soul had found its own light. Despite the hope that the tender soul had found its own light, reality had to go on. A cry had been heard, or perhaps a heavy silence had just passed, but regardless of the outcome, the moment of birth was over. The mother, as exhausted as if she had just stepped through another door of her life, was helped to her bed, the linen sheets soaked with sweat. In her arms, a tiny red baby stirred with each weak breath. And then, after a few prayers of thanks, after busy hands had wrapped the baby and cleaned the room, the birthing chamber suddenly returned to its usual quiet. Postpartum care, in the medieval way, was simple to the point of being cruel. No physician came to visit. There were no special medicines, and certainly no concept of a long rest. The mother would receive a bowl of hot, thin soup, usually a broth with a few vegetables, or bits of fat floating on top, as a reward for her recent victory. There might be a piece of white bread, if the family was well off, or a dry piece of cheese, if a neighbor brought it out of pity. And then, that was it. The midwife, after tying the swaddling clothes and packing her tools, would often leave immediately to get to another birth in the next village. She left the room to the family, taking with her the smells of herbs, smoke, and the sound of her steady footsteps. The mother now lay there, the pain still raw, the bleeding not yet stopped, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she was already expected to manage on her own with the newborn. No one taught her about stitches, no one knew of painkillers, and there was no comfort beyond a pat on the shoulder and the words, "You'll manage on your own." In the following days, her mother-in-law or sisters might help a little, starting the fire, making soup, watching the older children. But for the most part, the new mother had to get back on her feet sooner than expected. The sheep needed to be milked, the firewood needed to be chopped, and the other children still demanded to be fed. Society did not pause for a new mother to rest. The village simply saw it as another turn in the cycle of life, and women, by tradition, were expected to return to their work quickly, as if nothing had just happened. When her body ached, they would add more linen cloths, sometimes soaked in herbs to soothe the pain. If she had a fever, the priest might be called, not to heal her, but to sprinkle holy water and drive away demons. If her mind was troubled, she was usually advised to pray more. What we now call postpartum depression was then attributed to evil spirits, or a weakness of character. And so the woman had to endure in silence, hiding her tears behind her headscarf. Occasionally, small gifts would appear. A piece of old cloth to wrap the baby, a loaf of still warm bread brought by a neighbor, a handful of dried apples left on the table by someone. These gifts were not much, but they were enough to remind her that the community was still there, even if they couldn't raise the child for her. In this context, the only recovery plan was simple: don't die. If the mother survived the dangerous first few days, if the bleeding eventually stopped, if her milk came in on time, then she was considered victorious. And if both mother and child survived the first week, that was reason enough for the whole family to give thanks in church. And so, the mother would lie down again, her arms holding the tiny being tight, only to wake up earlier the next morning to light the fire, scoop the porridge, and lull her child to sleep with a lullaby mixed with long sighs. In the medieval world, postpartum care offered no gentle caresses, but one truth remained constant. Despite the hardship, despite the scarcity, these women resiliently cared for themselves and for their children. This resilience to care for herself and her child continued until 40 days had passed since the first cry was heard. That was when society was ready to welcome her back. Before she could step into the church again, the mother had to undergo a ritual, the churching or purification ceremony. According to medieval belief, childbirth was an act both sacred and unclean. Not sinful, but an act too closely associated with blood, with the body, with what was considered imperfect. Therefore, to participate in community rituals, to enter a holy place, the mother needed an official acknowledgement that she was clean again. On that day, she would wear her best clothes, perhaps just a well-washed linen dress and a coarse shawl, but it was enough to look decent. She might still walk with a limp, but in her hand she could carry a small candle. The flame was both to light her way and to remind the community that she had returned from the shadows, not as a wandering ghost. As she entered the church, no one would whisper criticism, but there were still scrutinizing glances. The priest would approach, recite a short prayer, sprinkle holy water on her forehead, and then open his arms, as if handing her a ticket back into the community. There was no music, no feast, just a few prayers and the sign of the cross. But for the mother, it was a release. At least she was no longer considered an outcast. Some women even looked forward to this day, not necessarily for sacred reasons, but because it was the first time they could leave the house after being confined for so long to the kitchen, the bed, and the whirlwind of milk, a baby's cries, and the smell of wood smoke. To stand among the community, to hold her head high, to hear the church bells ring, even for a moment, was enough to feel that she still belonged to the wider world. The ritual ended quickly, awkwardly, and somewhat coldly, but it marked the end of the period of being considered unclean. From now on, the mother could go to the market, attend prayers, and stand in processions without being shunned. Society breathed a sigh of relief, and so did she. However, this return came with a new cycle. By being purified, the woman was also implicitly reminded that she was ready, or at least expected, to enter into another pregnancy. The cycle of life repeated itself: childbirth, recovery, purification, and then childbirth again. And so, while the churching ceremony was seen as the medieval way of washing one's hands, it still carried a mix of small joy and a weary shadow. The mother would bow her head, light her candle, listen to the prayer, and in her heart she would both sigh in relief and silently wonder, how long until the cycle begins again? She sighed in relief while silently wondering how long until the cycle would begin again. But before she could dwell on that, she returned to the immediate cycle before her, feeding, lulling, comforting, changing, swaddling. But in the medieval world, that happiness was as fragile as a flame in a draught. People loved their children, held them close, but deep down, everyone understood that this love always stood on a fragile boundary. The infant mortality rate was so high that in some places, the village had more small graves than children playing in the yard. A third of all children did not survive their first year. The mother, after surviving childbirth, had to live with the constant worry. Would the baby make it through the winter? Would it survive a fever? Would it endure when disease swept through? The enemies of these tiny beings were plentiful. A cough could turn into pneumonia. A drink of contaminated well water could become dysentery. A fever of unknown origin was enough to make a tiny baby fade away in its mother's arms. Even teething, something we take for granted today, was once considered a dangerous omen, as so many children did not survive that stage. And then there were the fears of a more mythical nature. If a child was weak and cried incessantly, people would whisper that it was no longer human. It had been swapped by fairies in the woods, replaced with a changeling, a withered creature that would never grow strong. To counter this, some would place the baby on hot ashes, hoping its loud cries would force the fairies to return the real child. Others would hang iron charms over the cradle, believing the metal would ward off evil spirits. The mother, in her desperation, no longer knew what was true, and simply clung to these rituals as a final hope. When a child passed away, the funeral was usually quiet. No trumpets, no large tombstones, just a small wooden plank, a brief prayer with the priest, and then the earth was filled in. If the baby had been baptized, people would comfort each other by saying it had become an angel. If not, the pain was even deeper, as the young soul was believed to be forever wandering outside of heaven. The mother would embrace the emptiness, sometimes silently calling the child's name, sometimes choosing to give that name to the next child. No one blamed her for this, because in a world full of loss, even a name was seen as a way to extend a presence. Grief was unavoidable, but it had become a part of life, woven into lullabies, into sighs, into the wrinkles that formed too early around her eyes. Don't get too attached, people would remind each other, like a fragile shield for a vulnerable heart. But a mother's love does not listen to advice. The mother would still hold her child close to her chest, still pray every night, still watch over every tiny breath, because it was in that very fragility that love burned brightest, like a small candle trembling in the wind, but refusing to be extinguished. That love, like a small candle, trembling in the wind but refusing to be extinguished, was the very light that guided the mother into a new challenge, nourishment. There were no bottles, no formula, no ready-made mixes. There was only her own body, her breasts both sore and tired, which became the sole source of life for that tiny being. It was believed that mother's milk was a gift from heaven, but that gift did not always arrive on time. Sometimes the milk came in late, sometimes it only trickled, and sometimes the mother was so exhausted that she didn't have enough to feed her child. In those days, all eyes in the family were on her. Is the baby nursing? Will it grow? And amid the anxiety, advice would pour in. Rub some goose fat on your chest, the milk will flow freely. Avoid cold bread, or the milk will thicken. Pray to Saint Agatha. She lost both her breasts, so she will surely understand. This advice was not written in any book, but was passed down from mother to daughter, from neighbor to friend. The mother, though exhausted, would follow it because every hope was worth trying, as long as the baby was fed and did not cry all night. In wealthier households, if the mother was exhausted, they could hire a wet nurse. These were other women who had recently given birth, now becoming a substitute source of milk for the master's child. The wet nurse was seen as a savior, but this relationship was also very complex. The lady of the house would worry if her child was growing well, while the wet nurse had to feed both her own child and someone else's. Between the drops of milk lay a whole social class, a disparity, and sometimes jealousy and suspicion. Countless rules were also imposed. The wet nurse was not allowed to eat garlic, for fear the milk would smell pungent. She was not allowed to drink alcohol, as it was believed to make the milk sour. And she was absolutely forbidden from becoming too attached to the baby, because this child did not belong to her. In the feudal world, even emotions were controlled, so that the milk remained a duty, not a second form of maternal love. As for poor families with no money to hire a wet nurse, they sometimes had to resort to animal milk, cow, goat, or in rare cases, even pig. But with no sterilization, no way to preserve it, those drops of milk were like a pathway for disease to enter the cradle. The mother would still try, still coaxing the baby to drink her own milk, despite her aching body and her heart full of anxiety. There was no feeding schedule. They did not measure by weight or compare to growth charts. There were only the mother's eyes, watching to see if the baby's skin was more pink or more pale, its cheeks full or gaunt. If it looked a little less wrinkled than yesterday, that was considered good enough. If it cried persistently, the mother would hold it tighter, pray more, and turn to every folk remedy passed down to her. In the dead of night, in the thatched roof house, there were only two breaths merging into one. The sound of the baby nursing greedily, and the mother's soft lullaby. And in that moment, despite the hardship, the mother still saw a miracle. Life continued through her very own body. The miracle of life continuing through her very own body. And so, as time passed, the stressful first days began to recede. The child, if lucky enough to survive and nurse well, grew in its mother's arms. The mother, though not fully recovered, returned to the rhythm of her work, lighting the fire, fetching water, milking the sheep, hanging clothes, and lulling her child to sleep. But in the medieval world, a woman's life did not stop at one birth. It was merely the starting point of a repeating cycle, over and over again. As soon as the purification ceremony was over, when society acknowledged that the mother was clean again, the eyes of the family and the village would turn to her again, not to ask if she was well, but to await news of the next pregnancy. It was believed that the womb was a field that should not lie fallow. It had to continue to be sown, to continue to bloom, so that the family would have more labor, the lineage would have more heirs, and the village would be more populous and stronger. The husband, after 40 days of abstinence, also considered himself to have been patient long enough. He would return to the marriage bed without discussion, without preparation. It was considered a duty for both husband and wife. The mother, though still tired, would bow her head in acceptance, for there was no room for refusal in a society that valued duty over personal desire. Contraception, if it could be called that, consisted only of vague word-of-mouth tricks, drinking bitter herbs, tying a cord around the waist, or praying to the saints. But most were useless. The village's unofficial statistics were proof. Women gave birth one after another, less than 2 years apart, sometimes only 13 months. People would nod and say, that is the way of things. But for a woman's body, it was a merciless cycle. Every birth was a gamble. She survived this time, but there was no guarantee for the next. This child grew up, but the next one might be lost. Yet society did not pause for her to sigh. The cycle continued: pregnancy, birth, recovery, purification, and then pregnancy again. Like a millstone turning endlessly, a woman's body became the invisible machinery that sustained the entire community. And in the middle of the night, holding her small child to her chest, the mother would sometimes wonder, when will it end? But the answer never came. Because in this world, an end could only come in one of two ways. Either the womb could no longer bear fruit, or death arrived first. Yet strangely, amidst this harsh cycle, there were still moments of softness. When the child smiled for the first time, when it babbled the word mama, when its tiny hand clasped her calloused finger, it was these moments that kept the woman standing, that made her accept entering the cycle again and again, until time came knocking with gray hair and weary shoulders. In the small village, the cry of a baby still echoed, season after season, and the cycle relentlessly began again. The cycle relentlessly began again. But no matter how many times it was repeated, one could not help but be amazed each time it was overcome. After all the long, anxious nights, the pain that seemed to tear the soul apart, after all the times she nervously listened to the child's faint breaths, the mother was still there, holding her child in her arms. Her body was still weary, her eyes dark from lack of sleep, her heart still bearing the scars of fear. Yet when she looked down at that tiny being, she saw something that words could not describe. It was life. In the harsh medieval world, where winter could take an entire village, where a small fever was enough to steal a child, the very fact that a mother and child both existed after childbirth was a miracle. No castles or gold were needed. A single fragile cry was enough to turn a dark room into a radiant space. That miracle was not just in the child, it was also in the mother's resilience. In her pain, she did not give up. In her exhaustion, she still held her child close. In the darkness, she still prayed, even if her prayers were only a faint whisper. Every successful birth, every time a child continued to breathe, was a small victory against the fragility of human existence. The midwife, with her aged face but bright eyes, would just nod slightly. For her, it was just another day's work. But for the mother, it was something that would be etched in her heart for the rest of her life. And for the community, it was proof that life went on, even though death was always lurking outside the door. In the thatched roof room, the candle had burned down, the scent of herbs still lingered, and the child slept soundly on its mother's chest. She whispered softly. It was unclear if she was lulling the child or herself. "Sleep, my child, sleep in my arms. Tomorrow will be hard, but tonight we have won." And so, amidst the mud and smoke, amidst plagues and poverty, a small miracle still bloomed. Not glorious, not loud, just life continuing. Every breath, every heartbeat was a reminder that despite everything, humanity perseveres against the darkness. The mother closed her eyes, letting the sound of her child's heart merge with the rhythm of her own breathing. And in that moment, the whole world seemed to soften. There was no more howling wind outside the door, no more worries about the future. Only this moment, a moment where life, hope, and love reigned. That was the miracle. The simple miracle of the mothers of the Middle Ages, those who turned pain into strength, fragility into resilience, and every birth into a testament that life somehow always finds a way. And so, my dear friend, we have completed a journey together, from the whispers of the first trimester, to the dark birthing room with its wooden chair, to the heart-wrenching silence of the little souls who never got to cry their first hello. We have listened to the tired breaths of the mother, witnessed the calloused hands of the midwife, and seen the fragile miracle in every infant's cry. Now, as the candle in our story has burned out, you too can gently close your eyes. Let the steady rhythm of your own breath guide you into sleep. The fears and worries of today can be set aside, because like the mothers of that ancient time, we too can find strength in our vulnerability and find faith in the smallest of things. I wish you a truly peaceful night. Let this story be a soft blanket covering your mind, so that when sleep comes, you can almost hear the faint echo of lullabies from centuries past. Sleep well, my dear friend.